Escape from Giant's Crown. Chapter 10. Echoes of a Distant Battlefield. Oliff couldn't believe his eyes. The tall tales of lavish golden halls and opulent ballrooms within the Peaches were true. Built within the largest of the Peaches, the grand ballroom was enormous. Music, something jazzy and upbeat, echoed from speakers. Oliff looked around, expecting a party, but the place was empty. Perhaps they'd come too early. After months of passing out peach pins, he'd expected to see bustling crowds of impressively dressed peachers, but there was no one around. Tables loaded with delicacies lined the walls, stacked from end to end with piles of foods served on gold and silver platters. At his feet, Oliff noticed even the floor beneath them was emblazoned with a large ornate peach, a motif that ran throughout the entire hall. He'd never seen such wealth in all of his life. The marble floors were adorned with opulent diamond patterns, and the pillars were carved works of art. Satin curtains fluttered in the wind, revealing obscenely large balconies on either side. Long draping sheets extended from the ceiling, intertwining and connecting to the glittering chandeliers. "Hardly subtle, are they?" Oliff mumbled to Mao. But having eaten only moldy bread for the past several months, Mao was already preoccupied, mindlessly scarfing down cakes and fruit. Crumbs scattered as he stuffed his face until Oliff gave him a firm nudge. "Byron," Oliff said, "why have you brought us here?" From behind them came an unfamiliar voice.
"Why, for the party, of course."
The music screeched to a halt, leaving Oliff and Mao feeling like perhaps they'd broken something. Behind them, a large curtain parted along a raised stage, revealing 6 clearly distinguished women and men seated at a massive dining table. Their gold and white robes sparkled with diamonds. Reflecting light gave them an almost holy presence. Peachers, Oliff thought with a half-eaten apple in his mouth. He patted Mao to direct his attention to their hosts. The 6 Peachers were strangely still aside from the occasional jitter. They showed no emotions nor made any gesture of any kind. They seemed more like decorations than people. Despite having delivered several folks a full 5-pin status, Oliff did not recognize any of them, as they sat in an awkward silence. In fact, they barely moved at all, except for one. The woman sitting on a raised throne wore a stone mask, her horns twisted out from just above pointed green-hued porcelain ears. She'd nodded her head from side to side as if she were listening to her own music. Her elegant robe sprawled out, fluttering in the wind through the large opening behind her. Byron poked Oliff and Mao in the knees, gesturing for them to kneel as he dropped to a knee and removed his hat. "Gentle sirs and madams of the crown."
"You may dispense with the pleasantries, Mayor,"
interrupted the woman. She gestured slowly, royally, for them to rise.
"I see you've brought guests to my birthday party."
Her gaze passed Oliff.
"I seem to remember you mentioning a mere +1.
She grinned at her snickering panel of Peachers on either side of her until they stopped abruptly as if on command. The masked woman glided down from the platform to Oliff and Mao. Her demeanor was odd, predatory, as she tilted her neck to glare at the Moonken child.
"I certainly hope that you've brought a gift as well, my dear Byron."
"A gift? Yes, well, about that." Byron fidgeted with his hat. "Well, I thought, what I thought was..." He looked at Oliff, then down at Mao. Despite Byron's gift of the silver tongue, he could not conceal the guilt in his eyes for what he had done, for what was about to happen. He exhaled sharply and turned to Oliff. "I'm really very sorry, old chap." "Sorry?" Oliff asked. "For what?" But Byron would not meet his gaze. Meanwhile, the woman hissed hungrily, her fingers twitching with anticipation. "Now hold on a minute. Just what are you two up to?" Oliff turned sternly to the strange woman. "Who are you?" The ground seemed to tug at him, and when he glanced down, he felt like a fool. While he'd been preoccupied, coiling twigs had enveloped his legs, pinning him in place. He quickly lurched his arms out, reaching for Mao, but it was too late. Orchid's wooden tendrils had already ensnared him. He looked on helplessly as the roots and tendrils extended from the woman's lower body, tightened her grip around Mao, one tendril lifting him by the chest and the other squeezing him by the throat. Mao squirmed as he tried to break free from her grasp. "They call her Orchid," Byron said, just out of Oliff's reach as he clawed at the branches to break free. "A bit of a generous name to give oneself," Oliff growled, struggling and squirming on the floor.
"Oh, we're all named after flowers up here."
Orchid said distractedly. She seemed to be studying the Moonken's face with her hands. Mao didn't flinch.
You have no idea what you are, do you? Or what you were meant to be?
Orchid could barely contain her excitement, even from behind her mask.
Eternity is a long way to wait,
She continued.
Wouldn't you agree? Or is it that we've met before, on some distant battlefield, as friends or foe?
She spoke through him, as if she were communicating to some distant entity peering through the boy's eyes. A passenger.
I imagine that you believe that you had a chance this time. A chance to stop it all from happening again. Poor puppet. Doomed as we all are, down here time is a flat circle. And no matter how many times you come back, you can never change what will be. It is nature.
Sharp tendrils snaked up the boy's legs and between the torn scraps of clothing he wore. He struggled, but he couldn't even open his mouth to let out the slightest whimper as her appendages pierced his flesh and glowed purple.
Aren't you the lucky one?
She groaned as her eye slits flashed purple as well.
At least I'll put your time to good use.
As the years of life drifted from Mao's body into hers, the great golden hall turned a drab gray. All around them, bright tapestries frayed and split to a shredded brown. The golden pillars chipped and flaked away into dull stone and dust. Her deceptions faded in a haze of smoke, and it all became so clear to Oliff. The peachy dream that every man in Giant's Crown would have scammed or murdered each other to see was nothing more than a monstrous illusion. A trap, set merely to suck away at their life, all for a greedy, selfish, immortal witch. As Mao's hair grew 6 inches almost instantly, all the features of his face grew by several years as well. Oliff begged and pleaded for her to spare him, but the ritual proceeded, uninterrupted, until Byron rushed between Orchid and Mao. "Hey, he shouted. Hey, hold the blazes on." Ignoring him, Orchid hurriedly gulped down Mao's essence. "My dear Orchid." Byron wrung his hat in his hands. "Heaven only knows that this, my gift to you, must be incredibly satisfying. But aren't you forgetting a teeny-tiny little something?"
Oh, just what are you getting at, Byron?
Orchid snarled, annoyed at the interruption. A tendril lashed out and grabbed him by the throat. Byron flinched. "I believe my debt to the crown has been paid in full. Wouldn't you say that I've delivered on my promise?" Orchid's limbs lifted him from the ground and pulled him to her.
Do you?
Yes. In fact, I'm ready to take my rightful place beside you and... The stage of Peachers cackled, mocking the mere notion of his request. "And will relinquish my title upon adequate..." The titters quickly grew to giggles, then louder and more uncontrollable, some doubling over, though still trying to stifle further outbursts. Knowing very well that they were mere puppets under Orchid's control only made her mockery of him worse. Byron's face grew redder and redder. He clenched his fists around the wooden limbs that ensnared him, then yelled, "I believe I am owed my fair compensation." Orchid was greatly entertained. The entire table of puppet Peachers was now bursting into laughter, everyone roaring and wiping mock tears from their eyes, some holding their sides. "Oh, applesauce, I say," Byron yelled. "Pure applesauce and blueberry pudding." His lips shook so hard that they reverberated, rolling as peas. Then his eyes went buggy as the branches strangled him. Orchid finally laughed so hard that she dropped him to the ground. Byron gasped, sucking in air. "Enough of this charade," he heaved. "I brought you the child, and I damn well deserve what I was promised." He grabbed his cane and pulled himself to his feet. The Peachers went dead silent. Their faces looked wooden, empty of expression. Then, as if their strings had been snapped, they plummeted face first into the table and dissipated into black clouds of smoke. Only Orchid continued chuckling to herself as she lifted Oliff and Mao with her tendrils and directed her attention at Byron.
My poor, beloved fool. I would eat you as well if not that your remaining years were so few.
The implication that he was old made Byron furious, and while he sputtered and Orchid cackled, Oliff wiggled his arm loose. It wasn't much, but you can do a lot with one loose arm. For example, in the case of being suffocated by wooden tentacles of an immortal life-sucking witch, Oliff could reach into his satchel. What would a corrupt mayor's underpaid personal bodyguard keep in his satchel? Devices given to him by a bitterly unpaid, unappreciated doctor. Dr. Wheezy possessed several devices, and had given only one to Oliff, but it was one which kept the giant of giants crowned enslaved in slumber. As Oliff held the small metal contraption in his hand and thumbed the buttons and switches, he knew that this was his one and only shot. This was his ace in the proverbial hole. He had no idea how it worked, but as he smashed it over Orchid's stone mask, he quickly understood why the good doctor had appropriately called it his doomsday device. The fragments of metal from the smashed box and stone from Orchid's mask mingled and sprawled across the marble floor. Stunned, the witch's wooden limbs fluttered about wildly, dropping Mao and Oliff with a thud. Oliff rushed to grab hold of Mao. As the last blinking light from the small box flicked off, outside the window the large metal bindings which covered the giant's eyes ceased as well, snapping off entirely. He let out a groan that shook the mountains. When the enslaved colossus opened its eyes for the first time in 100 years, they spiraled with the fury of 2 fiery suns.